it was something that was inescapable. It was a priority for him, and that's what we're looking at with a lot of these things, with these disciplines, is there's these things that will allow us to focus on our purpose of godliness, to become more godly, to become more obedient to God, and to set those times aside so that we don't want things to be just by rote, but we do want things to be, in a sense, kind of automatic, where that's just part of our day, or just part of how we handle some part of our spiritual lives. And so that's really what we're trying to get, some of the things we're trying to get at with this. And so as we get into this class tonight, I want to just throw that question out to you, is when I say worship, I mean, what is worship as far as defining it, or what comes to mind with it?
Worship is our praise to God, to show our gratification that we have of His gift that He offers to us, to acknowledge Him as the Creator, as the one true God, and to try to glorify His name and show Him how happy we are to be His children.
Okay, so praise to God, thanking Him, acknowledging Him as being the gifts that He's given us and what He is. What else?
I think so often when we say worship, I think our minds automatically go to corporate worship.
Mm-hmm.
When we're all together in one place, like we've done tonight. But worship can be and mean so much more than just a body of people being together, for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously that is worship. But worship is something that we can do individually on a daily basis, at any time.
And I think that's a great point. It's something I may come back to you in a little while on that point, because I think you're bringing up a great point when we think about worship and what it is. Anything else?
When I think of worship, I think of joyful, humble submission.
Joyful, humble submission. Mm-hmm. Good phrase. As sort of a general definition of it, it's one phrase or one definition was act of reverence. You're prostrating or crouching before an act of service. Of course, and that can be, and I'll throw the question out. When we're talking about, in a sense, our minds automatically go to some form of worshiping God, and we'll go to the thing, can we worship other things? Okay, exactly. What other things, in a sense, do we might have reverence for where we shouldn't? What's that?
I said anything else.
Anything else?
Like
Yeah.
wealth?
Wealth. We can think of a lot of different things. Anything that we're putting on this pedestal, right? That we're, to use the phrase, kind of crouching before or laying ourselves before. I actually wasn't going to hit this verse till later, but something I thought about was on the way up here was Psalm 122. I think we may hit this one later, but I'm going to bring it up now. Calling it audible is a dangerous thing when I'm teaching, but this verse that's come to my mind was Psalm 122. Maybe it's one of the first ones you thought of too, about kind of if you're thinking about attitude of worship. But I was glad when they said to me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord." So this attitude of being excited about it, and we might think during the week and stressed out work or life and all the things we're dealing with, and what a blessing it is to. And we should have this attitude in that case, especially, that we have this joy that we want to worship God. Another example, since we're in Psalms, Psalm 96. And not unlike last week, we'll spend some time in the Psalms. I found myself coming back to several of these as I thought through the lesson over the past several days. Psalm 96, I'm going to have trouble not continuing on, but I'm going to try to limit this to just a few verses here in this psalm. But Psalm 96, beginning in verse 7, ascribe to the Lord, O families of the people. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory of his name. Bring an offering and come into his courts. Worship the Lord in holy attire. Tremble before him all the earth. And the passage goes on. Another example I think of is, I'm turning over to Revelation chapter 4. So I'm turning over Revelation which is probably about a chapter past where I have any business turning to and teaching anything on, but there's this great phrase, a couple sentences in here that I think about. Actually going back kind of context-wise, back junior year of high school, so Steve Klein, you've heard mention, Joe goes on trips with him. he was teaching a class, and he had us all, we were going through the book, the writings of John, but particular emphasis on Revelation, and he had us all drawing pictures from all the imagery in Revelation. And for a person who shouldn't be doing anything more than drawing a picture of like a bridge, loading it and all this stuff, as a structural guy, or back then stick figures, kind of a scary thing to do. But this book has such incredible imagery, and I find in Revelation 4, when I think about worship, I think about this scene being in verse about 8, we'll jumping into this, making the point of what this worship, we might think sort of this almost idealized case or something of it. I just really like this, so I'm going to read through a few verses here. Again, Revelation 4, beginning in verse 8. And the 4 living creatures, each one of them having 6 wings and full of eyes around and within, and day and night, they do not cease to say, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God the Almighty, who was and who is to come. And when the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who sits on the throne, to him who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders will fall down before him who sit on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever, and will cast their crowns before the throne, saying, Worthy are you, O Lord, our God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you create all things, and because of your will they existed and were created. And so we have this imagery of this constant praising to God of talking about him being holy, and you have these elders, and I kind of have this vision, this picture in my head of these. They drop their crown, they're bound before constantly, and they pop right back and they drop this crown down. This crown appears again. It's just constant. This constant worshiping of God is recognizing who he is. And so I think it's just really great imagery in this. And you see this elsewhere in Revelation 2 as well, but it's just one example of it. Now I want to jump over to this idea that Todd brought for a second, throw that question out to you, and Todd already kind of answered it, but if I might add to it, is worship just a group activity? We might think, especially in this setting, right, that might be the first thing we go to, is worshiping as a group activity, right? So can you think of an example maybe of, whether of the Bible or elsewhere, or maybe just in our lives, how we might worship not in a group setting?
A lot of the Psalms seem to be songs of praise or prayers that are, written by David or someone, but many of them speak of being out in nature, and whereas the author is seemingly alone.
Mm-hmm. And you see, of course, David a lot of times being alone or in a small group, a lot of his life and early part of it, some of the things he was dealing with, calling out to God too. Of course, also asking for help in a lot of those cases too. Another one I thought of was actually in Job. So I'm actually we're over in Psalms, I'm going to turn over to Job for a second. So first chapter in Job, kind of maybe a very specific instance, but something I thought about is where you can see somebody that's alone but still worshiping God. And in verse 20, so this is kind of the first round of things that's come against Job, it's testing, and about verse 20. So, he keeps getting this bad news just over and over. Oh, these people have been killed. Oh, this happened to you. Oh, this happened. And then, it's like no one's left, and he's there, maybe just with this servant who's just come in. But verse 20, then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. I got to think about that because we all know this kind of this situation, but it occurred to me that he's worshiping God. Specifically, he uses that word, at least in my version. So here he is, basically very alone in a sense, and he's worshiping God, as it specifically calls out. And there's other instances of this. We can look at the Romans 11 and 12, where it talking about we can turn there real quick. This gets a little bit different than what we think as far as worship insofar as some of the normal instances, but I think there's a point to be made here too. I'm going to actually start back in 11:33 just to get a little context here. So Romans 11:33. Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who became his counselor, or who has first given to him that it might be paid back to him? For from him all and through him, to him are all things, to him be glory forever. And then verse 12, therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the means of God, present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable God, which is your spiritual service of worship. So even our actions of living it as we should, as being ourselves, just serving God in a general sense as far as doing what we should be doing is a form of worship to God. Anything else on that?
You know, I think we can even look at Jesus, and there were times that he even made a point to tell the apostles, I'm going off by myself, you know, to be alone, you know, and there were times that was in prayer. But, you know, that was incorporating worship to God. He himself, by himself, for the purpose of getting away from everyone to have that time with God.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, excellent point. If any other hear that about where Jesus would go off on his own, we see him going off his own. Again, a lot of times I think about the example I can think of are in prayer, but still going off on his own to worship, to pray to God. Anything else on that before we move on? Okay, so the next, go ahead.
There was a time when Peter fell at Jesus' feet after Jesus showed him that he was God.
Mm-hmm.
And Peter said, Lord, leave me because I'm a sinner.
Mm-hmm.
That was a moment of worship.
Yeah.
He humbled himself before God, admitted he was a sinner. He told Jesus to go away, but that's not really what he had in mind. He was expressing gratitude that he was there.
Mm-hmm.
But he certainly wouldn't be telling the Lord to go away. He was expressing how humble he was, and how joyful he was to be in the midst of God.
Great. Yeah, I appreciate all the great points on this. Next question I want to propose to us is, why should we worship God? Why should we worship? What is the purpose of our worship? As far as that, why we should worship, we can go to the 6-year-old answer. Well, because I told you so. And I say that almost, I don't mean to sound that kind of flippant when I say it, but I mean that's part of this too. Is God has that right to tell us this, and we looked at Matthew chapter 4, where Jesus is being tempted. What was one of his responses? Remember what he said as far as there was one that related to worship. Matthew, I don't remember. Let's worship the Lord only. So yeah, it's actually the last one, right before the devil left him. Go, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship. And this is after where he's telling basically Jesus, hey, here's all the things I'll give you if you just fall down and worship me. And he says, no, you worship God. So we're told this, and of course he's telling this to Satan. And we can think about, we alluded to Deuteronomy 6, fear God only and worship him. And again, there's a lot of Psalms that convey the same thought. Philippians 2, if we turn over to Philippians 2, and we'll probably, in a couple of these passages, we'll hit a couple times, so I may just allude to these if we come back to some of these same passages. But Philippians 2, verses 9 through 11. A lot of these I realize I'm jumping in the middle of without giving a lot of context, so bear with me to save time. We're jumping into for the point related to worship. But for this reason also, God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee will bow, of those who are in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and that every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is the Lord, to the glory of God the Father. When I first was thinking about this passage, the way I actually wrote it was bow now or bow later, and then realized that's not really right. What it is bow now because we're all going to be bowing later before God. So we need to be worshiping God now because we're all going to recognize at the end, one way or the other, we're all going to be there before him, kneeling before him. I've got several others, but I'll stop just for a quick second and see what immediately jumps to y'all's minds as far as why we should worship.
You know, Jonathan, one of the verses you already went to in Revelation, you know, verse 11, so simply tells us why. You are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, For you created all things, and by your will they exist and were created. He is worthy for us to worship.
By the way, that is literally the next verse I had on here because I think that is such a great point about how that he's worthy of worship. He's worthy of praise. We should be worshiping him. What else?
I think we need it.
No.
I mean, we are created with that inherent desire to worship something. And, even, like we're kind of talking a good bit about alone,
Mm-hmm.
but like we need that time to worship together with
Mhm.
others.
Yep.
Like you said, getting away from the world
Yep.
and being around like-minded people who understand the gravity of what life is really about,
Yep.
and to be able to be there to encourage each other,
Yep.
and through worship, and to build each other up, and to be there for each other.
No, I think that was a question I was going to pose to us here in a minute was does God sort of need it? We won't turn there. I've got two passages. We won't turn to the first one, which is Micah 6, where it talks about that. Does God need it? He doesn't need it like we need him, and he doesn't need it like we need. Well, let's turn to the other passage that I had written down for that point. Was Acts chapter 17. We'll see. So Acts 17, trying to see how much we can narrow this down a little bit, but I think we know this theme, but I'm still going to read several verses here. So Paul's standing before these men of Athens, and being in verse 23, for while I was, again, Acts 17, if I didn't say that. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you, the God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and exist, and even some of your own poets have said, for we also are his children. So, keying on that part before, God doesn't need us to command the sacrifice, but it wasn't like he's commanding the sacrifice because he needs to eat. And so, of course, with Athens where they're at, imagine even more so with the sacrifices and things that they're doing. So he doesn't need it. He deserves it. He's worthy of it. Certainly for us, part of this too. Anything else that jumps to your mind as far as why we should worship or the purpose of it? Okay. A couple other things I thought about is, one thing I thought about actually just a couple chapters over is even in our worship, making known to others. When we think about teaching others, we might automatically go to a Bible study or something like this, but I think about Acts 16, this example with where Paul and Silas are in prison, and I'll just read one verse of it. But here they are in prison, beginning, so when around verse 22, but then in verse 25, but about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns of praise to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. Of course, the earthquake and the jailers converted. They were singing and praying. They were worshiping God in this incredibly difficult circumstance. And imagine a lot of us have found ourselves singing or praying in difficult circumstances too, but you never know who is listening, do you? You never know. And in a case like this, where how many people would think to do that? Perhaps, hopefully, when we are in difficult circumstances, that's one of the things we think about doing. But when we worship, even that may be a form of teaching to others. It can encourage us. We can know more about God when we're singing songs to each other, and while so many of these things come from Psalms and reminding us of God's teachings as well. But I think, again, going back, that I think the thing I keep coming back to with this is that Revelation 4, like we talked about, is He's the creator. He's worthy. He's deserving of it. He's done so much for us that we should be worshiping him. Yep.
So when we think of our relationship with God, so we have that relationship because he first loved us,
Yep.
right? Because he loved us to the extent that he was willing to send his son, allow him to leave heaven and to come here and die a terrible death for us, for our sins, for the things that, for us turning our backs on him.
Mm.
He loved us and said, I want you to come back, and here's the way. So that great gift instills a love in us for God. And if we think about it in an earthly sense, when you love your wife, it makes you want to do things to recognize her, to appreciate her, to show her that love that you have for her. It's the same with God. We have a love for God that's even beyond the love that we have for our wife or our kids or whatever that is. And so it causes us to want to show that, to want to express that to him.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what we do when we worship.
And I think you bring up something that really ties into the next question that I was going to pose to us tonight, which is how do we, okay, we've talked about why we should worship, and we're kind of hitting upon some ways, really in the ways that we honor God in it, in a sense, but I want to drill down that a little bit more for this question of how do we honor God in worship, or maybe it's also in answering that, we also answer how do we develop habits with God honoring worship. So something I thought about with this was our honoring God, if we think about it particularly in a group setting, really should start before we ever get there. Something whether it's, I remember and Joe in a lesson talking about rushing around, because you rush around on Sunday morning and how you prepare beforehand, because otherwise you're really distracted and everything. I think setting our intentions, as this goes still a bit to your point, I'll come back to your point again a little bit in a second. But I think about that passage I read at the beginning about desiring worship, really thinking through, am I really desiring to go to worship? Do I really want to be here and worshiping with our fellow Christians? Another practical thing I thought about, this is something I learned from somebody years ago, was probably back in the CDs or maybe in cassette days, but somebody was mentioned during a class one time they would listen to worship music on the way to worship. And I thought that was a good idea. And we now do it, and now we've got Henry hooked on doing it too. Put him to sleep tonight, so I'm not sure what I should take out of that. But I think that's from a practical matter, I think that's a really good thing as well as we prepare ourselves as we go to worship. But some of the things I think to your thing as far as having the right attitude, I think it's important for us to engage our spiritual attributes, our love, like you said, our thanksgiving, our submission, our service. We think about discernment. I think that goes beyond just the Lord's Supper. Humbling ourselves before God, that idea of kneeling, awe and reverence. Another passage we won't, given our time is almost up, we won't turn to this, but Hebrews 12. John 4:23, we are to worship in spirit and in truth, setting our minds on why we're worshiping and how we're worshiping. And who's in our presence when there's 2 or 3 gathered? What does Matthew 18 tell us? Where 2 or more are gathered, God is with us. Remember, though, to the point again about when we're on our own, though, God does still see us. Psalm 139. If you want to jot that down, God's still with us and watching over us, even when we're doing it in a private manner. Remember that we're engaging in that worship. Remember this. Can worshiping, when we're talking about like on a Sunday morning or Wednesday evening, what have you, can it be? I mean, it can be pretty tough, right? To focus. I mean, we got 1,000 things. We're trying to center our minds. Maybe we've prepared and done things. And Ben, I remember one of your lessons talking about what you see from the pulpit. And I tell you what, with little kids, I tell you one of the things I most appreciate is after Kaylee's had one of those days with the boys when they were little, and we're trying to and I feel like we're frankly in the lobby more than we're in there and just trying to gather some nugget of it. And a grandmother or somebody will come up to us and be like, just keep trying. Get out what you can. Just focus on doing the best you can to help them understand. And so obviously there's another matter there is trying to teach them to appreciate worship and at least sit through worship. But what other kind of practical things as far as that can help us honor God in our worship, or maybe if there's other practical things that come to your mind when you think on that point? Maybe,
So Jonathan, one thing that you talked about, and Kyle kind of was leading into, I think it's important for us to remember that, even already in this class, we've talked about things that individually, that reading, and I know we're going to get into studying, and all that. Those are things individually that we can do to draw closer to God, me to God. Worship, getting into the idea of corporate worship is something that we can do as a spiritual family to draw ourselves closer to God together. And in that, it should draw us closer to each other because of this thing that we're doing. And there's no more important thing that we can be doing together.
one of my favorite things to do that helps me sometimes is in that moment is just to kind of, especially during singing, you kind of look around, realize we've got this great large group and we're all singing together and we're all singing to each other. We're singing praise to God, but we're also talking to each other. Hey, we all want to, get to heaven. We're all trying to support each other for it. And I think that's an incredible thing that we have, incredible blessing we have to be able to worship together, and to sometimes we just have to take that moment and kind of appreciate what we have in that moment of being able to have this connection with, we're all got the same goal in mind, and maybe that's part of it too, is keeping that focus as well. I want to turn to one of the Psalms before we run out of time. One thing that I don't think it stops in the worship though, in honoring God. And I did not make a little note on this, so I hope I turned to the right Psalm. So Psalm 27. Psalm 27, we'll read just verse 4. One thing I've asked from the Lord, that shall I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to meditate in his temple. Ultimately, we've got that goal of worshiping with God, being part of that, those incredible hosts there in heaven, but even here, meditating, being able to be seeking that, having this attitude of, I want to be part of that. I want to be part of that constant worship, being part of that dwelling with God. And also just constantly kind of reinforcing that attitude, but also when we do leave, when we've had that time together, we've worshiped God together, do we reflect on it afterwards? Do we take it? Do we just leave it behind? Or as we go home, it's immediately thinking about lunch or whatever the next thing is? Or do we take a moment at home to take advantage of what we've learned, of what we've worshiped together, and really applied it and honor God, not just in the moment of our worship, not just in that, but then maybe in our private worship. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it. Donald will have it next week. Self-examination, is that right? Okay. Thank you all.
Very good.